Caleb Darnell Monroe was 41 years old the night he stood in the hallway of his own home and heard his wife tell her mother, in a voice low enough to feel private, but not low enough to disappear through plaster, that he would not last a year. To the world that saw him, Caleb was a quiet man with careful hands and a leased pickup truck and a two-bedroom house in the Wedgwood Hills section of Memphis that needed more work than it had received. He wore the same brand of boots for 3 years before replacing them. He brought his lunch to the job site in a metal cooler his uncle had given him in 2009. His wife's friends referred to him, when they thought he could not hear, as dependable. They did not mean it as a compliment. What they could not have known, what Lorraine had never thought to ask in 7 years of marriage, was that the man in the hallway with the metal cooler and the worn-out boots had spent the last 4 years building something in silence, the way he built everything, from the foundation up, one level at a time, without announcing the blueprints to anyone who hadn't earned the right to see them. What she did not know was that he had transferred a controlling interest in Monroe Site Development, LLC, to a holding company 12 months before she began meeting with her attorney, and that the holding company was worth, as of its most recent valuation, $2.3 million and growing. She thought she was describing the end of his story. She had no idea she was standing inside the opening chapter of her own. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The evening had started simply enough. Lorraine's mother, Estelle, had arrived around 6 with a covered dish and the particular energy of a woman who had opinions she was managing with great effort. Caleb had shaken her hand at the door. Estelle had never graduated to hugs, and taken her coat and offered her sweet tea, which she accepted without thanking him, which was her customary approach to most things he offered. Dinner passed without incident. Caleb ate. He listened. He asked Estelle about her garden, which she kept in immaculate condition on the east side of her house in Germantown, and she told him for 11 minutes about a blight that had troubled her dahlias, and he nodded in the places that required nodding. Lorraine watched him across the table with the expression she had developed over the past year. Not contempt exactly, more like the look of someone watching a clock they have already decided is slow. He cleared the dishes. That was his habit. He had been raised by his grandmother, Ida Monroe, who had told him once that a man who left the table without clearing it was leaving someone else to carry his weight, and that she had not raised a man who left his weight for others. Ida had passed 4 years ago, at 81, in the house where she had lived for 50 years and raised 11 grandchildren on a school teacher's salary and the force of her own considerable character. Caleb still kept her photograph on the shelf in his workshop. Not the formal portrait, but the one taken in her garden, her hands in the soil, looking at something outside the frame. He had her hands. Everyone said so. He carried the dishes to the kitchen, filled the sink with warm water, and began washing. The kitchen was separated from the living room by a short hallway, and sound moved through that space the way sound moved through old houses, without asking permission. He had bought this house 3 years into the marriage. It had needed work, which was the reason he had been able to afford it. He had laid new subfloor in 2 bedrooms himself, rebuilt the back steps, replaced the kitchen fixtures on a Saturday, while Lorraine was at a brunch she had dressed for since Thursday. The house was not remarkable from the outside. The bones were good. Caleb understood bones. He was washing a serving dish when he heard Lorraine's voice drop to the register people use when they believe a wall is listening instead of a person. "He's not going anywhere, Mama. He doesn't have the nerve." A pause, the sound of Estelle setting down a glass. "Then why are you still—" "Because I need the year," Lorraine said. His name is on two things that matter, and I need the year to move them." Another pause. Then, quieter still, with the certainty of a woman who had done the arithmetic and was satisfied with it, "He won't last a year. He never lasts at anything." Caleb stood at the sink, with the serving dish in both hands, and the warm water running, and the sound of his wife's confidence moving through the walls of the house he had rebuilt with his own hands. He turned off the faucet. He dried the dish. He placed it in the cabinet. He had his grandmother's hands, and she had taught him what to do with them. He went back to the living room, said goodnight to Estelle, told her the dahlias would come back in the spring, and went to bed at his customary hour. The next morning, he called his attorney. Deshawn Lattimore had handled Caleb's business formations for 6 years out of an office on Union Avenue, a single-floor suite that smelled of old paper and good sense. He was 54, trim, with reading glasses he kept on his desk rather than his face, and the manner of a man who had heard most things and been disturbed by very few. Caleb sat across from him that Tuesday morning and told him everything he had heard, not in a rush, in the same measured sequence in which he would describe a structural problem on a work site. Materials, timeline, what held, what didn't. Deshawn listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, he removed his glasses from the desk, held them, did not put them on. "The two things with your name on them," Deshawn said. "You know what she means. The house and the business account at Regions." Caleb had thought about it through the night. "The business LLC is already restructured. She doesn't know that. The account she can see has $18,400 in it. And the rest? She doesn't know about the rest." Caleb said it without satisfaction. "She has never asked me a detailed question about the business. Not once in 7 years." Deshawn looked at him for a moment. "She thinks she married a site foreman." "That's what I looked like when she met me," Caleb said. "I didn't correct her." It was not a defense. It was an observation. He had always been more interested in building things than in describing them. Deshawn pulled up the corporate records on his screen. Monroe Site Development, LLC, had been formed 5 years ago. Initially as a vehicle for subcontracting work Caleb had been doing independently for a regional general contractor named Hatch. Hatch had retired the following year, and rather than fold back into employment, Caleb had absorbed 2 of Hatch's smaller client relationships and grown from there. Methodically, reinvesting revenue, keeping his personal overhead deliberately low. The leased pickup, the metal cooler, the boots that lasted 3 years. Every dollar not spent on appearance was a dollar that compounded. 12 months ago, on the advice of Deshawn and a financial advisor named Portia, who worked out of East Memphis, Caleb had transferred the majority interest in Monroe Site Development into a holding structure called Cornerstone Asset Group. The transfer was legitimate, documented, and executed before any legal proceedings had been initiated. It was not done in anticipation of a divorce. It was done because Portia had told him that a growing business held in a single owner's name was a liability exposure waiting to happen, and Caleb had agreed with the logic and acted on it the same week. The timing was, as Deshawn put it, simply sound planning. "What's she going to find when she goes looking?" Caleb asked. "A house with equity, a business account with $18,400, a man who drives a leased pickup." Deshawn looked up. "She is going to be surprised." Caleb nodded once. "I need to know what she files and when. I'll have a monitoring flag set on the county clerk's docket by this afternoon." Deshawn set his glasses down again. "You go home. You act normal. You give her nothing to work with." Some traps, Caleb's grandmother had said, were not set with bait. They were set with patience. He drove back to the job site. He ate his lunch from the metal cooler. He worked until the light changed. That evening, he reviewed the Cornerstone documentation himself. Not because he doubted the structure, but because he was an engineer, and engineers verified their measurements before they trusted them with weight. Everything was in order. The formation date, the transfer date, the notarizations. The capitalization records showing a clean, premarital origination. Portia had built the structure with the same care he brought to a foundation pour, and it held exactly as designed. He slept without difficulty. 2 days later, Deshawn called him with the name of the attorney Lorraine had retained, a woman named Cheryl Vance, who operated out of a mid-sized family law firm in East Memphis and had a reputation for aggressive asset discovery motions. She had been practicing for 19 years. She was not an attorney who made sloppy moves, which meant that whatever she filed would reflect what Lorraine had told her, which meant that whatever Lorraine believed, she believed with enough conviction to stake her legal fees on it. Vance had filed a petition for divorce that morning. The grounds were irreconcilable differences. The asset claims listed the house, the Regions account, and here Deshawn's voice carried a note of professional interest, possible business interests believed to be held by respondent. Believed to be. She had suspected something was there. She had not found it. She had been living with him for 7 years, and she had not found it because she had not looked. Not out of trust, Caleb understood now, but out of the particular incuriosity of a person who has already decided what kind of man someone is and stopped gathering new evidence a long time ago. To Lorraine, he had always been the man in the worn-out boots with the metal cooler and the unremarkable truck. She had not asked what was under the surface because she had already decided there was nothing worth finding. That was her error. It was not a small one. Caleb pulled the Regions account statement that evening and reviewed it with the same neutrality he brought to a site assessment. $18,400. Joint account, her name and his, accessible to her attorney through standard discovery. It was real money. It was not nothing. But it was not what she was expecting when she walked into mediation with a number in her head derived from whispers and assumptions and 7 years of watching a man she had underestimated set his lunch cooler on the passenger seat every morning like he had nothing to hide. He left the statement on the kitchen counter where it had always been left. He cooked rice and chicken. He ate. He washed the dishes. Lorraine came home at 7:30. She sat at the table and looked at her phone. She did not mention the filing. He did not mention it either. They were, in that particular moment, 2 people sharing a house that had already been decided upon, moving through its rooms with the care of people who understand that a structure has its limits, and that exceeding them solves nothing. He asked if she was hungry. She said she'd eaten. He said goodnight and went to the workshop. He stood at the shelf where Ida's photograph rested and looked at it for a moment. His grandmother in her garden, her hands in the soil, looking at something outside the frame. He had always wondered what she was looking at. He had decided at some point that it didn't matter. She was looking forward, and that was enough. He drove to his Aunt Betty's house that Saturday evening, a brick ranch in Orange Mound where he had spent every Christmas of his childhood. Betty was 69, his grandmother's youngest sister, the keeper of the family's institutional memory, and the kind of woman who knew things without being told because she had been paying attention longer than most people had been alive. She met him at the door already knowing something was wrong. She said she could tell by the way his car stopped in the driveway, that he parked like a man with things to set down. They sat in her kitchen while she made coffee, and he told her. He told her about the hallway, and the whispered words, and the certainty in Lorraine's voice. He told her about the filing, and about Vance, and about the asset claim that assumed more than it could prove. He told her about Cornerstone and the valuation and the 14 months of clean structuring that now stood between him and everything Lorraine thought she was walking away with. Betty said nothing for a long moment after he finished. She poured his cup. She poured her own. She sat. "She told her mama you wouldn't last," Betty said. "She did." "What'd you feel when you heard it?" He thought about that. "Like I was watching a building settle," he said. "When you know the foundation isn't right, you don't cry about it. You document it." Betty looked at him over her cup. She had Ida's eyes, not the color but the quality, the patience in them. Ida used to say you built quiet, said you were the quietest builder she ever knew, said most men built loud so people would watch. She said you built like you were having a private conversation with the materials. She said tools were meant to work, not shine. She did. Betty set her cup down. "What are you going to do?" "What I always do," Caleb said. "Finish what I started, and let the work speak." Betty nodded slowly, the way a woman nods when she has already known the answer and just needed to hear the person in front of her say it out loud. She refilled his cup without asking. She asked him about the Fraser's school project, and he told her. She asked about the Midtown bungalow he'd been looking at, and he told her that too. They talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with Lorraine, and by the time he stood to leave, the weight he had carried through her door had redistributed itself into something manageable. "She thought she had you figured," Betty said at the door. "She had the version I showed," Caleb said. "That was all I offered." He drove home that evening and cooked dinner and left a plate for Lorraine when she came in at 9, without explanation for where she had been. He did not ask. He watched a documentary about civil engineering projects in the American West and went to bed at his customary hour. He was watching. He was waiting. He was almost ready. The mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the petition was filed, in a conference room at Vance's firm on Poplar Avenue. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows on one side and a long table with more chairs than were needed. Caleb arrived with Deshawn and with Portia, his financial advisor, who carried a structured binder and had the particular composure of someone accustomed to rooms where large numbers were discussed without flinching. Lorraine was already seated when they came in. She had dressed carefully, a deep burgundy blazer, her hair done, composure in place. Estelle was not present. Caleb noted this with interest. At the preliminary filing, Lorraine had mentioned to a mutual acquaintance that her mother was supporting her through this. The absence from mediation suggested a recalibration. Cheryl Vance opened professionally, laying out the asset claim in clear terms. The marital home, the region's checking account, and what she described as business interests that we believe exceed disclosed amounts based on lifestyle evidence and third-party characterizations of the respondent's professional scope. Lifestyle evidence. Caleb looked at his boots under the table. 7-year-old boots, resold once. Deshawn allowed Vance to finish. Then he placed the first document on the table, the formation records for Monroe Site Development, LLC, current as of this quarter. He placed the second, the transfer agreement to Cornerstone Asset Group, dated 14 months prior, fully notarized, cleanly structured, executed before any legal proceedings had been initiated, or, the records confirmed, before any divorce consultation could be documented on Lorraine's end. Vance picked up the transfer document. She read. She read it again. The controlling interest in the operating company transferred to a holding entity prior to filing, Deshawn said, with the calm of a man reading a weather report. The holding entity is separate legal property, formed and capitalized before the marriage exceeded its 3rd year. Under Tennessee statute, Those assets do not constitute marital property subject to equitable distribution. Vance set down the document. She looked at Lorraine. Portia opened her binder to the second tab and placed the current Cornerstone Asset Group valuation on the table. A 6-page independent appraisal dated 40 days prior, commissioned for a pending investor partnership that had been in discussion for 2 quarters. The total portfolio value was listed on the executive summary page, clearly, in the way that honest numbers were always listed. $2.3 million. Lorraine looked at the number. She looked at Caleb. He said nothing. He did not arrange his expression into anything in particular. He was simply there, the way a well-built structure was simply there, without apology, without announcement. "The Regions account," Vance said, recovering. "That remains a marital asset." "It does," Deshawn agreed. "The equity in the home as well. We are prepared to offer a fair distribution of both, along with a structured transition arrangement." Lorraine leaned toward Vance and said something at low volume. Vance listened. Then Vance said, "My client would like to understand the timeline of the Cornerstone transfer." 14 months ago, Deshawn said. "The documentation speaks to the date." "And the reason for the transfer at that specific time?" Portia answered that one. "Standard asset protection structuring, recommended for any sole proprietor business clearing 7 figures in project revenue. Mr. Monroe implemented the recommendation within the quarter it was made. The recommendation itself is in our records dated 16 months ago." She turned to the relevant tab without looking for it. "If counsel would like to review the advisory correspondence, we have copies." Vance reviewed the correspondence. She reviewed it a second time. The room was quiet enough that the ventilation system made itself known. Lorraine's composure had not broken. She was not a woman who broke easily. Caleb knew that about her, had always known it. But the quality of her stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of someone waiting to receive what she had already decided was hers. It was a different kind of stillness. The kind that came after a person understood the full dimensions of a room they had walked into without measuring. She turned her eyes to Caleb one more time. He met them, briefly, and looked away. Not in discomfort, simply because there was nothing left in that direction worth examining. "Lorraine," he said, and his voice was level and without heat. The voice of a man who had set something down and was no longer carrying it. "You said I wouldn't last a year. I'm still here. The work is still standing. That's all I've ever had to say." He pushed back from the table. He thanked Deshawn and Portia. He gathered nothing because he had brought nothing to gather. He walked to the door, held it open for no one in particular, and stepped out into the hallway. Behind him, the room was silent. 18 months passed like a second winter. Caleb was on the back deck of a new house in Midtown by the following October. A craftsman bungalow he had purchased and was renovating in stages, the same patient way he had renovated everything. He had re-sided the exterior himself over 6 weekends. The deck was new construction, pressure-treated lumber, quarter-inch gaps between each board for drainage, built exactly as he would have built it for a client, because he believed there was no other standard worth keeping. He had a mug of coffee. The morning was cool and clear and smelled of cut grass from the neighbor's yard 2 houses over. Jade came to the door and looked out at him, and then came outside without saying anything, which was one of the things he had come to appreciate about her. She was a project coordinator for a commercial real estate firm in Midtown, direct in the way of someone who had learned that indirectness was expensive, and she asked questions that were actual questions rather than performances. On their second evening together, she had looked at his truck and said, "You drive that on purpose." It was not an accusation. It was an observation. He had said yes, and she had nodded as if that confirmed something she had already suspected, and they had gone inside. Monroe Site Development had completed 2 municipal contracts in the preceding year: a drainage infrastructure project in Shelby County and a site preparation engagement for a school construction in Fraser. Cornerstone Asset Group had added a 3rd equity position. Portia had revised the portfolio valuation upward. He had hired 2 full-time crew members and was considering a 3rd. He had also, on the 1st anniversary of Ida's passing, established a small trade scholarship in her name through a vocational program at a community college in North Memphis. $500 per recipient, 3 recipients per year, for students pursuing certifications in skilled construction trades. It was not a large sum, it was a beginning. Ida had always said that beginnings were the work. Lorraine had settled on the terms Deshawn had offered in mediation. She had received her equitable share of the marital home's equity, $47,000, and half the balance of the Regions account. She had relocated to an apartment in Germantown near her mother. She was working as an account manager for a staffing firm. He had heard this from a former mutual acquaintance who had mentioned it without intending anything by it, and Caleb had registered it the way he registered any information that required no action. He set it down and moved on. Cheryl Vance had filed no further motions. Estelle had not reached out. Some doors, when they close completely, and that was not a sad thing. That was just the nature of load-bearing walls. Caleb set his coffee mug on the deck railing and looked at the yard, a rectangle of grass he had already measured, already begun to imagine differently. He would put in a raised bed along the south fence in the spring. Good soil amended with compost. Something that took patience to grow. He was 42 years old. His work was standing. His foundation was sound. He was not the kind of man who lasted a year. He was the kind of man who built things that outlasted the conversation about whether he could. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.